Hello everyone, and welcome to our 37th president, Rchard Nixon. If you're a Simpsons fan, you should be laughing right now because there's the middle name, Milhouse. So here we go. Died in fairly modern times, 1994 in New York City. Another Quaker like President Hoover. Remember, they were also related, I think cousins of some sort, right? So here we go. Long career in politics, very long career in the House, and then a vice president, and in the Senate. 1968 defeats Humphrey in very good electoral landslide. 1972, the biggest electoral landslide to that point in history. And we'll come back to that election because that was the election that centered around the Watergate scandal, which if you look at the electoral votes, there was no reason or need to do anything extraordinary to ensure victory in that election, which pretty much made Watergate pointless, which is, again, almost a tragic irony of the whole incident, right? So he had two vice presidents. Spiro Agnew was actually removed from office for crimes, but then Gerald Ford comes in, and we'll talk about that later, Gerald Ford being an important president as well. Okay, so we have the Watergate scandal, and there's some things here about the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War and also his issues with China. So let me just sort of take this a little bit out of order, and let's actually focus on the Vietnam War first, and then we'll get into more domestic policies. Nixon promises to get us out of Vietnam. He reduces our involvement of troops on the ground. But what he secretly did was, at the same time we're reducing troops on the ground, he expands the air war. So we start bombing not only North Vietnam, but we start bombing Cambodia and Laos, which were areas of supplies for the North Vietnamese. And most Americans didn't know this, obviously. You're the Congress really know this, which caused some problems, obviously. The big term for him is called the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. Basically kind of going back to what Kennedy, this is their war, giving it back to them. This is not our main responsibility, okay? There's also another doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine, and this is reducing our overall focus, or forces, I should say, in Asia generally. We're going to withdraw forces from Asia. There were some other incidents. In 1968, there was the My Lai, M-Y, capital L-A-Y massacre, where American soldiers pretty much burnt down villages and women and children died. We mentioned this in class. Just sort of the rules of war broke down, and it was hard for soldiers to tell who was the enemy, who was not, and you just saw some of the frustrations come out, and there was a tragedy there, unfortunately. In 1972, the last combat forces are withdrawn from Vietnam. So the cost of 58,000 American dead, over 300,000 wounded, and the war itself cost $110 billion. Okay. Other issues are his new China policy. Nixon is the first president to visit China since the Communist Revolution of Mao in the 1940s. He also is a big backer of making sure that the mainland China is the China that is represented in the United Nations. Up to this point, because China was a communist country, we didn't recognize China, so we recognized Taiwan as the real China. Because if you remember the revolution, the Communist Revolution in China, remember Mao beat the forces of Chiang Kai-shek in China, and Chiang Kai-shek's forces and supporters sort of went to Taiwan in exile. So that was the country that we recognized as China. Finally, in 1971, we recognized actual China. There's also a treaty called SALT, S-A-L-T, with the Soviets. It's a Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. So this is an attempt to sort of draw down and withdraw nuclear weapons and control them. Also, 1970, from a domestic issue, you have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Also in 1969, we have the first man on the moon. I'm going a little bit out of order, but 1969, the first man on the moon, sort of that promise that Kennedy made is fulfilled. And we also have the 26th Amendment, which is an important one, especially for everybody out there listening and watching. This gave 18-year-olds the right to vote across the country. Before this point, every state determined the voting age. This changes that. So now, because of the Vietnam War, the thought was, if you're old enough to go off to Vietnam and serve your country and perhaps even die for your country, you should have the right to vote. So that became a across the board, I should say, recommendation that every person has that right. Okay, now the Watergate issue. 1972, there's two things at play here. Nixon created a group called the Plumbers, and the Plumbers were supposed to stop the leaks in his administration. People were leaking out information. Well, this Plumber group also kind of decided to try to do some of their own investigations without really the president really knowing about it. And what this group did was it basically broke into the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., which was the headquarters of the Democratic Party, Nixon's Republican. And what this group did was plant listening devices, bugs, in the Watergate Hotel to listen on the conversations of the Democratic Party so they could have an advantage in the election. All right. Now, Nixon didn't know anything about this, but the problem is that when Nixon found out about it, he didn't come out about it. He tries to cover it up, and he erases tapes of conversations and so forth, which just makes it look really bad. There were also something called the Pentagon Papers, which are right on the sheet here, were leaked to the New York Times, and this document shows how much the administration really was covering up and keeping secret how much it expanded the war in Vietnam, and that really hurt Nixon's credibility along with the Watergate. There was a Supreme Court case called United States versus Nixon, where it was about Nixon trying to get this suppressed from the New York Times, and this was a freedom of the press case where it was ruled against the president that these were allowed to be published in the New York Times. Now, in the impeachment, because of Nixon's obstruction of justice, trying to cover up all this, he was impeached, right, in 1974. It just says Johnson before him, and now Clinton coming up in 20 years later or so. The president was not removed. Remember, an impeachment is only an indictment. They bring charges against the president, but before the trial can pursue, and Nixon resigns from the presidency in 1974, August. Now, Nixon probably still would have been convicted, but one of the first things, we'll get to it in the next president, Ford does is he pardons Nixon from all crimes. And the president has the right to pardon anybody that they want. Now, that was a big controversy for Ford, which I'll mention because it does hurt his presidency, but Ford thought it was in the best interest of the country to move on and not to have a trial of a president, and a president possibly even be serving jail time, which would just be damaging to the country as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about miscellaneous fun facts. The Millhouse in his middle name was his mother's maiden name. He's about 5'11", 175 pounds. He was a man of really complex emotions. He's lonely, hypersensitive, very suspicious and secretive. He grew up in poverty. He helped man his parents' fruit stand during the Depression. Kind of ironic, when he was 10 years old, he read a book about the Harding administration and the whole Teapot Dome scandal, which we mentioned in class. And here's a quote: "I would like to become a lawyer, an honest lawyer who cannot be bought by crooks," which is ironic a little bit. A very hardworking and serious student, played golf, liked to bowl. They actually had a bowling alley put in the White House. Liked to play poker and read history. So there you go. There's Rchard Nixon, and I hope everybody has a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.